We saw earlier that there are distinct steps in this system. Okay, all the steps are arranged sequentially. If I can't establish inside position, the whole system stops right there. Okay, so everything begins with inside position. Once we establish inside position, then it's all about creating a sense of distance and connection. I have to be close enough to capture my opponent's knee within my knee line and form a solid connection to my opponent's hips and legs. In the case of the straight Ashigarami game, we've seen that that form of initial connection is typically an arimi Ashigarami, or entering Ashigarami. That was a great way to form a solid connection to our opponent's hips and legs. Then we went to phase 2 of that particular subsystem. The idea of creating heel exposure. If I can't expose my opponent's heel, nothing else counts. I don't care how good your Ashigarami, I don't care how strong you are, I don't care how tight your heel hooks are. If you can't physically expose your opponent's heel, nothing else is going to follow on. We've seen inside Ashigaramis are the best method of exposing our opponent's heel in this situation. Then, once you've exposed your opponent's heel in competition, that's when the panic buttons start lighting up in your opponent. They will do everything possible to get out of that situation. You will be absolutely stunned at the amount of resistance you will receive at World Championship level from talented athletes who know how to get out of these positions, who have a good understanding of jiu-jitsu and a good understanding of leg hooks. The amount of resistance you have to deal with is staggering. And so you need every possible mechanism to shut that resistance down. We've seen that resistance comes in 3 forms. Your opponent can either break up your Ashigarami, destroy the integrity of the Ashigarami itself. They can start rotating in a way where they're rotating faster than you're rotating and shut down your ability to apply force to the heel. Or they can play a distance game and pull their knee out from the knee line. In practice, usually it's a combination of all 3 which is used to escape from a heel hook. We saw a 4-step system to shut this down. We formed a connection to our opponent's legs, we exposed the heel, we shut down their escape attempts, and now we got into a breaking position. We've seen that when it comes time to break, we favor more than any other in the straight Ashigarami subsystem the idea of an outside Ashigarami finish. The key to an outside Ashigarami is to understand that we get opposing forces. My Ashigarami goes in one direction, and my mechanism of breaking, the heel hook, goes in another. Think about this like tearing a piece of paper. If I put a piece of paper in your hand and ask you to tear it, it's the easiest thing in the world. Why? Because when you go to rip the paper, your hands go in opposing directions. Breaking someone's leg or tearing someone's leg is no different from tearing a piece of paper. Ultimately, it's about putting forces in opposing directions to get the job done. The problem most people have is they apply breaking forces in one direction. Tragically, they usually do it in the same direction that their Ashigarami is going. So not only do they have a weak breaking force, but they're actually assisting their opponent in escaping by pushing them in the exact direction of their escape. It's a disaster. And that's why heel hooks were so ineffective for so long. What I did is to change the way people finished heel hooks in the Ashigarami positions by opposing the force of the Ashigarami directly against their opponent's escape and against the direction of the break. I strongly differentiated between the Ashigarami, which goes in one direction, and the break, which goes in the opposite direction. In this way, you can create strongly opposed forces on the leg that will tear a man's leg just as easily as you tear a piece of paper. We need to go now into the precise elements of breaking mechanics. I'm a huge believer in the idea of coaching breaking mechanics to a point where you ultimately come to believe that if you can get into a breaking position on anybody in the world, you can break their leg with the greatest of ease. If you don't believe you have this power, in top level competition, you won't fight hard to get to your opponent's legs. I don't care how smooth your Ashigarami entries are. I don't care how good you are at exposing your opponent's ankle. I don't care how good you are at negating their escapes. If you don't believe you have the capacity to break your opponent's leg at will, you will not try hard under duress and pressure and competition to get through to an Ashigarami and get to the break. your own mind will find ways to prevent you from getting there. But if you believe in your heart of hearts that you have the ability to break a man's leg with a well-applied heel hook, under the stress of competition, you will find ways to get to that breaking position in the heat of combat. Let's have a look at some of the fine details of breaking from an outside Ashigurami situation. We know the big picture. The big picture is I want my Ashigurami going in one direction and my breaking mechanism, the heel hook, going in the opposite direction, just like tearing a piece of paper. We know already that the force of my Ashigurami is always revealed by the direction my knees are pointing. Wherever my knees point, that's where the force, the direction of force is being applied in the Ashigurami. Okay? We know that typically outside Ashigurami is used as part of the four-step sequence. We start with a Rimi Ashigurami, we go into inside Ashigurami, we go across into far hip Ashigurami, and now ultimately we end up in the outside Ashigurami to finish our opponent. Okay? When I go into outside Ashigurami, there are sub-varieties of Ashigurami. Okay? I can just have my feet close together. I can post my foot on my training partner's hip. I can have bottom leg under. I can have bottom leg over. They're all good in terms of breaking power. Some are slightly safer than others. I usually play between all of these minor variations, and I've had good results with all of them. Which one you choose ultimately will be a personal choice. Okay? Now, when it's time to go in and break my training partner's leg, I want to maximize my use of lever and fulcrum. So often I see people failing to do this by gripping improperly. So often I see people, when they go to put a grip in, putting their wrist in a mechanically disadvantageous position. Most people are happy simply to lock their hands and just work for the heel hook from this position. Okay? Don't be one of those people. There's a clear demarcation line which signals whether or not I'm working mechanically and in a mechanically efficient way with lever and fulcrum here. That line is your opponent's ankle. When I look at my opponent's ankle, I want to take my wrist and ensure that my wrist operates below my opponent's ankle. The moment my wrist starts to go above my opponent's ankle, it's very easy for my opponent to point his toes and slip his heel inside my wrist. This is a constant source of trouble. In addition, even if I go to apply breaking pressure now, I'm doing so in a way where I cannot employ simultaneously an efficient pushing and pulling force on my opponent's leg. I've said a number of times now, I must work with opposing forces when it comes time to break my opponent's leg. It's important you understand there are two opposing forces, not one. The first opposing force is between the heel hook and the Ashigurami. That's the first. But there's a second one. That's the distinction between the push on the toes and the pull on the heel. Ultimately, what I want to do is to create a pull on the heel and a simultaneous push on the toes. If I am not doing that, I am never going to be able to maximize my breaking pressure with a heel hook. So there are two ends to the lever of the foot, not one. The first end is the line of the toes. That's this line that goes from the first knuckle of the big toe to the first knuckle of the smallest toe. I need to take my opponent's toes and put them into my bicep. Not the armpit, the bicep. I need to line my forearm up with my opponent's foot. The more my forearm lines up with my opponent's shin, the less successful I will be. I want my forearm to line up with the foot here, never with the shin. When my forearm lines up with the shin, a simple pointing of his toes and a heel slip, he'll escape every time. I put the toes in the bicep and I line everything up with my wrist below his ankle with the foot. When I go to lock, I have several alternatives. The most versatile is a palm-to-palm lock. Off the palm-to-palm lock, I get an ability to use my forearm as a lever arm on my opponent's shin, like so. This is one useful form of lock. Another very useful form of lock in this situation is for me to cross my wrists, like so. This has the advantage of reducing the circumference of the grip around my opponent's heel and creating strong pressure. I can go further with this and lock figures of 4. I can go still further and lock reverse figures of 4. They're all good. I'll be spending some time on this very shortly. Okay? But our first thing is to make sure that our forearm lines up with our training partner's foot. That's always our number one concern. In order to maximize my use of lever and fulcrum in this situation, I have to understand two ends of the lever, toe line, and heel below the ankle, so that when I go to lock up with my training partner and my feet come in, I can go into a strong finishing position. When I go to finish, I need to do two things. I need to push on the toes and pull on the heel, so we get opposing forces. The only way I can do this is to start by turning my right elbow back into my ribs. Then, by coming up on my right elbow and lifting, I generate extreme braking pressure. So, when I lock in, I don't want to be down on my shoulder. I want to do my finishes on my elbow. The first thing is I connect my elbow to my ribs. That's going to create a very strong pushing force on the toe line. Then I want to lift on the heel so that my head rises in a well-applied heel hook. There's a critical rule which you must understand, the rule of head and hands. If my head, as I apply the heel hook, moves away from my hands, power will bleed out of the heel hook. Wherever my head goes, my hands must follow, so that everything moves and the distance between my head and hands never changes. I'll say this again. If the head moves and the hand don't, all of the power will bleed rapidly out of the heel hook. I must contour my body over his, and then head and hands move together, with the head moving in a curve away and up from the mat. Okay? In this way, you can create ungodly braking pressure. So, our drill, we put our fist inside, and we put the toes inside our bicep. We align our forearm with our training partner's foot. We make sure our wrist is below the ankle, never above the ankle. From here, the first grip I'm going to demonstrate is a palm-to-palm grip. I cover my training partner's shoelaces with my chest. I employ a back heel that makes sure my ashigarami goes in one direction and the heel hook goes in another. Now, I begin everything with a push on the toes by connecting my elbows to my ribs, and then a pull on the heel where my head and hands never change distance between each other. Okay? I'll just demonstrate one time on bananas. Okay. Once again, we're in the outside ashigarami position, and I want to go in on my opponent's leg. I need to take my opponent's toe line to my bicep. So I lift, and I put the toes into the bicep. The next thing is I put my wrist below his ankle, just like so. Then from here, when we lock up, we're going to start with a palm-to-palm grip. Okay? I want to use my elbow on top of the shin to lock everything in place. My feet pull inwards. I connect my elbow in towards my own ribs. I haven't even begun the lock yet. I've only just put tension in the leg. From here, we start the action of lifting the heel, and we'll get the break. Okay?
That's not. Jesus. Oh, that's strong.
We're starting now to get into the fourth and final phase of one of the most important subsystems of the overall or general leg lock system. the straight Ashigarami subsystem. We're looking at the idea of the braking phase, which is the culmination of a series of steps. It began with entering and connecting to our opponent's legs and hips, then creating heel exposure, then the idea of negating our opponent's attempts at escape, and then finally finishing our opponent with a strong break. I want to spend some time now on a general theory of braking in Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu, of course, is based around the idea of ultimately controlling people until you can either break a limb or strangle them. So it's very, very important we have a clear understanding of what we should be trying to do anytime we go in to break someone's joints. There are three critical elements behind the general theory of braking. The first we've already alluded to. This is the idea that whenever we go to tear someone's joints, knees, arms, or what have you, it's very, very important that we work with forces in opposing directions. There is a direct analogy between tearing pieces of paper and tearing knees. You have to be able to apply forces upon your opponent's knees and ankles in opposing directions. As a general rule, I want my Ashigarami going in one direction and my braking mechanism, the heel hook, going in another. Now, a second key element to the idea of braking, the notion of follow-through. It is absolutely essential that you be able to take an opponent up to the point of breaking and then go beyond it. Just as a good boxer never throws a punch at his opponent, but rather through his opponent, so too with submission holds. All the time I see talented athletes who can get to a breaking point. I'm not interested in you getting to a breaking point. I'm interested in how you're going to go past the breaking point. This is the notion of follow-through. Think about a golfer hitting a golf ball. Imagine we had a golf ball set up on a tee and we went to swing as hard as we could, but the second we made contact, we stopped the club. How far do you think that golf ball would travel? Not very far at all. Compare that with a golfer who not only makes connection with the ball, but follows through all the way and sends it hundreds of meters down the fairway. When you go to break the human joints, you must do the same thing. You must be able to get to the breaking point and still have sufficient drive to be able to go far beyond it and through. Let's have a look at a situation where, working from outside Ashigarami, we see exactly how this applies. We've seen that once we get in on our training partner's legs and put ourselves in a breaking position, there's a certain point where we put tension into our training partner's legs. When I start the action of pushing on my training partner's toes and pulling on the heel, there comes a certain point where we're getting close to the break. Okay, I'm going to take Bernardo close to a point where there's some tension in the leg. Okay, I'll just stop there. Now, you can clearly see my body is not even close to being fully extended. Okay, this is where I am, and this is where Bernardo will begin tapping. But you can clearly see that if I remove Bernardo's foot, from here I still have a tremendous movement potential far beyond the point of tapping. Okay, I always have to arrange things so that when I get to the breaking point, I have a capacity to continue going on and through. If I don't have that, I'm not going to be able to break people's legs. Yes, you'll put people under stress. Yes, you'll make them uncomfortable. But at World Championship level, there has to be a viable threat of a genuine break if people are going to tap. You will be stunned at how much pain, pressure, and torment people are prepared to deal with in pursuit of gold medals and money. In order to make people tap at that level, there has to be a strong sense of follow-through. So once again, I can never have my body at full extension by the time I arrive at the tapping point. There has to be some degree where when I lock onto my opponent, here, Bernardo is ready to tap here, but I still have an ability to follow through on my training partner. Okay? How do we train this ability to develop follow through? My favorite method of training this is the one-handed drill. This is where I perform a heel hook on my training partner with only one hand. When we're in competition, of course, we want to lock our hands together to maximize our breaking ability. But in training, what I will often have students do is work from a situation where they lock up with one hand, just like so. From here, they apply the Ashigarami with their legs, and with one hand, they practice the skill of turning the corner and then forming a lift on the heel. Okay? Once you get to a position like this, there's going to come a point where just the action of your forearm muscles can generate a tap in an opponent. My hands are not even locked, and yet my opponent is in a position where they can't really tolerate much more. But from here, I can generate tremendous follow-through pressure, which will go through my opponent's leg. I'll say this again because it's so important. It's not enough to get to a breaking point. You have to train yourself to get to a breaking point and still have sufficient follow-through to go through and get a decisive break should the situation demand it. We're looking at a general theory of breaking. We've seen already two key components. The first is this idea that we want forces in opposing directions upon the joint that we're attacking. Until you have opposing directions, you'll never generate a genuine ripping force. Think always of the analogy of a piece of paper. Two hands moving in opposite directions makes it such an easy task. Second was the idea of follow-through. The idea here was that anytime we're engaged in athletic activity, we have to project force on our opponent, whether it be with a punch, whether it be a throw or what have you, a strike upon something with a club. We have to be able to follow through the object upon which we're imposing that force. You can't just go to the object and stop. You have to go through the object in order to actually do damage. Joint breaking is exactly the same. I have to be able to arrange my body in such a way that I get to the breaking point and I still have a strong potential to continue in the direction of the break in order to fully break the limb. Okay? Now, the third key element in our theory of breaking, the idea of creating tension and taking the slack out of the joint prior to breaking. Think about an analogy. If I hang a rope from the ceiling and the rope is very long and coils around the floor so that the rope is very slack, if I give you a sharp knife and ask you to cut that rope, you will have to whip your hand at tremendous speed in order to be able to go through the rope. Why? Because the rope is slack. There's no tension in the rope. So the only way to go through it is through speed. If I take that same rope and I stretch it from the ceiling tight down to the floor with a heavy weight so that it's tight and vibrating like a piano wire, now when you take that same knife, it's the easiest thing in the world to cut it with just a single blow. Why? Because there's tension in the rope. And as a result, the cut will have a catastrophic effect upon the rope. Human joints are exactly the same. If my opponent's joint is in a relaxed state of being where there's no tension whatsoever upon the ligaments and tendons, it's very hard to break the joints. But if I first create conditions where my opponent's tendons and ligaments are vibrating with tension and tightness, then the act of breaking is extremely easy. Let's have a look at a demonstration. Whenever I get into a breaking position, it's up to me to create a sense of tension and slack removal before I begin the actual break. So when I come into Kawamoto's leg and lock up, and I get everything in place, my first thing is to maximize tension in the ligaments and tendons in the knee and ankle before I even begin the action of breaking. This is done in several distinct steps, the most important of which is my Ashigarami, my legs back heel. Again, back heeling refers to the action of my heels coming back to my own buttocks, just like so. Okay? From here, I want to start positioning my head. I bring my head around, lined up, so that my body goes into a straight line. I don't want my body bent, like so. That relieves tension on my training partner. So the first action is the back heel of my legs. Okay? Then my head goes around, so my body starts to go into a straight line. Then we connect both of our elbows close to our rib cage. As the elbows come in close to the rib cage, the head and the hands move together so that we feel extreme tension coming into the leg. I can feel at this point that Kawamoto's tendons and ligaments are starting to vibrate. At that point, even a small amount of additional pressure will create the break that I'm looking for, okay? What I don't want is to attack my opponent's heel in a state of relaxation. You often see people make this mistake. There's no tension whatsoever in either my legs or his, and then they try to use speed to jump into the lock, okay? It's a hit or miss policy where most of the time it misses, and occasionally when it hits, it's an uncontrolled break, okay? A much better way for us to operate is always to lock everything up and get that tension running through my training partner's body. You will see this in your opponent's musculature. The actual legs start to tighten up. Okay, the muscles around the legs start to go into a protective mode where they tighten up around my opponent's body. And you'll feel that tension through your opponent's body. And now, with maximum tension, now the break comes so easy. The result is that you can break people in minimal distance, and that's what you're looking for. If I have to move my opponent's body or my own body a significant distance to get a break, that means the chances of success in international competition are relatively low. The object is to be able to minimize the distance in which I can effect a break. And this is done by transmitting tremendous tension throughout the leg first, prior to the break, so that the break itself comes from just a tiny movement. It's very, very difficult for your opponent to stop those small movements. As we lock up, you can see from here, I start the tension at the legs. The legs pull me into my opponent. We tie everything up, and now, in a matter of millimeters, I can get a break, okay? As opposed to a situation where there's no real tension in the legs, and I have to move significant distances to get any effect at all, okay? So this is the third keynote theme in our theory of breaking. We've seen the ideas of opposing forces, the idea of follow-through, and now the idea of taking the slack out of the joint first prior to the break. If we can reliably perform these three behaviors prior to actually trying to break the joint, you're going to have a lot of success and put your opponents under a lot of pressure with your heel hooking. We've been looking at the notion of breaking mechanics for heel hooking. One of the most important components of a strong breaking heel hook is the nature in which I grip my opponent's legs. We've seen different ashigaramis. We've seen how we go to exert force at the end of the lever. Let's look now at the role that different grips play when we go to attack our opponent's legs. First, a little backdrop on gripping. I can grip my hands in various different kinds of ways. And as we progress through different grips, you'll notice something interesting starts to happen. When I lock my hands together, there's obviously different ways I can do so. The first is generally a 10-finger method where my 10 fingers lock up with each other like so. When I lock a 10-finger method, you will see there's a certain circumference around my arms, the circle of my arms. Okay? As I go through different grips, that circumference gets smaller. When I change from 10-finger to palm, there's a small decrease in the circumference of my arms. As I go to a wrist-to-wrist grip, that circumference gets even smaller. When I go to a figure 4 grip, it goes even smaller still. So, in the case of strangulation, for example, if I start off with a certain grip like so, the wide circumference makes for a rather inefficient strangling grip. As I tighten things up, I go into a palm-to-palm grip, we get a tighter circumference around the neck and a tighter strangle. Until ultimately, by the time we use figure 4 methods, you have a very tight grip around the neck and as a result, very strong strangulation. So as we progress from 10-finger to palm to wrist to figure 4 grips, the circumference of our arms decreases. We can use this in the case of heel hooks. Very often, I will start with a palm-to-palm grip. In my opinion, this is the most versatile form of gripping that I work with, okay? And it has certain advantages to it that we'll soon see. But this is not the only way of working, and we've seen that as we progress through various grips leading all the way up to figure 4, we're decreasing the circumference of our arms around our training partner's ankle. You can get additional tightness. And myself and my students will often employ these methods to create stronger heel hooks in certain scenarios. Let's have a look at the pros and cons of each different kind of grip. Working from an outside Ashigarami situation, since that's our favorite breaking grip, we go to work like so. Let's look first at the palm-to-palm grip, okay? The advantage of palm-to-palm is that it's very versatile, and it does have one very good mechanical feature. When I come up and lock onto my training partner's ankle, always working below the heel, when I lock my palm-to-palm grip, the wide circumference that it generates enables me to take my elbow and employ that top elbow as a wedge on top of my training partner's shin. Okay? If I hit my elbow outside my opponent's shin, there's a lot of slack around my opponent's heel, and quite easy for my opponent to start escaping. But when I lock up on my training partner and I put my elbow on top of the heel like so, it tightens everything up, and it creates a situation where my two elbows come in very close to each other, and now from here we get tremendous braking force. Okay? Nonetheless, there's times, for whatever reason, you feel you cannot get your elbow on top of the shin. And now the palm-to-palm grip will tend to be relatively ineffective. It might be because my opponent is posting his hand inside my tricep, and as a result I can't get my elbow in the desired position. Okay? In these situations, I will switch grips, and I will go to a wrist-to-wrist grip, like so. Okay? Once I employ a wrist-to-wrist grip, I can no longer get my elbow on top of the shin, but I don't need to, because the circumference of my arm grip is decreased. So I get tightness in other ways. Okay? Now I lock my elbow outside my opponent's shin instead of on top. As Kawasara goes to hold me off in situations like this, it's extremely easy for me to generate bone-breaking force in this, or ligament-tearing force in this position. Okay? So if I feel I cannot get my desired elbow position, a nice alternative for me is to lock in a wrist-to-wrist grip on my training partner. Now we get very, very strong braking mechanics. This can become even stronger or even tighter when I lock up a figure 4 grip on my training partner's ankle like so. Now when he goes to move away, we get tremendous braking pressure. This has an additional benefit. It puts my chest as a wedge on top of my training partner's shoelaces, and it almost precludes the idea of hand fighting. When my opponent goes to separate my hands, there's just nothing to grab, and as a result, we quickly get tremendous braking pressure, regardless of our orientation. Okay? Now, the last and arguably the strongest of all these grips is the reverse figure 4 grip. I start off like so. My opponent is interested in stopping my hands from locking. So I shake my arms out, I pass my arms around the corner, and I put what appears to be the wrong wrist inside and underneath my opponent's heel. Now, I get a unique ability to be able to push my elbow in towards my training partner's hips. Okay? At the same time, I can pull on the heel. This grip is so strong that even from the weakest forms of Ashigarami break, even when my opponent is turned over, from here you can still get tremendous braking pressure by pointing your elbow at your training partner's buttocks and lifting on the heel. Okay? We will often make use of these various grips when we're going into the braking phase. Once I get my initial grip in place, okay, I see the resistance I'm getting, and I assess whether I'm going to go palm to palm, which leaves some space for my opponent to hand fight. He can separate my hands here. Okay. Wrist to wrist, which greatly closes the space and makes hand fighting much more difficult. Figure 4, which almost completely closes hand space and makes hand fighting almost impossible. And reverse figure 4, which is ridiculously strong to the point where if my opponent goes to move out, twist out, etc., regardless of our orientation, we're going to be getting very, very strong forms of grip. Okay? So those are different ways to employ hand grips to up the volume of the braking power of your heel hooks. We're looking at the idea of braking mechanics in the case of the straight Ashigarami family that we're looking at. All of our best breaks occur out of the outside Ashigarami position. That's our preferred braking position when we're dealing with very strong, talented opponents. It's okay just to go through the whole cycle with the Rumi Ashigarami on less experienced opponents. That's fine. We'll come back to that later. But when we're dealing with the World Championship level, the toughest opponents, we typically go through a cycle of Ashigaramis, okay, until we arrive at the preferred breaking Ashigarami, outside Ashigarami. Now, we've been talking a lot about grips, we've been looking at a general theory of breaking. Now it's absolutely critical that we look at the function of our legs in breaking our opponent's legs. Remember, if you have to rely on your hands and arms to break people's legs, you're not going to have that much success. Ultimately, the real horsepower of your breaking will come from your legs and your hips. It is critical you understand this. Now, you'll remember at the start of this DVD, we talked a little bit about the idea of levers and fulcrums. This is where this kind of talk starts to become very, very useful. We saw that one of the important characteristics of a good breaking fulcrum in Jiu-Jitsu is the hardness and the placement of the fulcrum. The harder the fulcrum, the better. Okay, if I try to break an object over a soft fulcrum, it's very, very difficult, often impossible. If I need to break a piece of wood and I have a choice between breaking it over a deflated soccer ball versus a hard brick, of course I'm going to choose the hard brick. It's a better breaking fulcrum. So too with the human body. When I go to break someone's joints, I want to bring them over the bony, hard elements of my hip bones, not over the soft inner thighs. Heel hooking often employs this simple principle. Let's look also at the critical notion of directionality of force. When I go to apply my Ashigarami, the overwhelming majority of the breaking power of an outside Ashigarami and a straight or outside heel hook comes from the inside leg. This is something that was not well understood for many, many years. You have two legs in any given Ashigarami. You have an inside leg between his legs and an outside leg. I have to learn to cycle my use of inside and outside leg depending upon what I want to do. When we looked at the initial system, a Rimi Ashigarami, inside and outside leg are neutral. When I go to expose my opponent's heel, I have to use the outside leg as a dominant force. There's a cycle now of outside leg dominance that exposes my training partner's heel. The critical mistake that most people made is that when they came to use their legs, they retained outside leg dominance when it was time to break people. And that was a terrible, terrible mistake. When my outside leg is dominant, it's pushing my opponent in the same direction as the escape. And it means that when I go to apply the breaking force on the heel hook, my outside leg is alleviating pressure. Okay, as I try to turn my opponent's heel to the right, my outside leg is pushing in the same direction to my opponent's right, okay, to my left. When I go to apply pressure, my dominant outside leg is actually assisting Kawamasaru in the direction of his escape and making his job easier. In addition, when I go to apply breaking force on the heel, my outside leg is actually pushing him in the same direction that I'm trying to apply breaking pressure. It's relieving pressure on my opponent's ankle. And that's why for so long, so many people attempted heel hooks without results. You have to learn to cycle inside leg and outside leg depending upon what you're trying to do. Yes, when I want to expose my opponent's heel, I need to be outside leg dominant. That's what exposes my training partner's heel. Okay? When I go to follow my opponent's turn, yes, I should be outside leg dominant. But when I come over on the other side, it's all about the inside leg. The inside leg is now dominant, and it pushes down on my training partner's knee in such a way that I can affect the break. Okay? Anytime I go to break my training partner's leg with a heel hook in the straight Ashigarami system, subsystem, my inside leg does the work of pushing in one direction against the work of my heel hook going in the opposite direction. This is a point so important that I'm going to spend some time on this right now. Here's my inside leg. Here's my outside leg. We have the heel hook in place. My inside leg must push to my right, while my arms torque his ankle to my left. Only in this way can I exert a true braking force on my opponent's legs. Watch my inside leg, okay? I take my inside leg and I dominate my opponent's knee with the inside leg. I push down on the knee. If there's no push down on the knee and my legs are straight, then it's just my arms cranking to my left. There's some power, but nothing crazy. The moment my inside leg starts pushing down on the knee while I torque in the opposite direction with my arms, you're getting braking force. This is why it's easy for me to exert braking force even with one hand. Okay? The inside knee pushes Kalmasaro's knee out to my right, while my hand torques his ankle to my left. In this way, you get a genuine rotating force on his lower leg from knee to ankle, where his upper leg is going to the right and his lower leg is going to the left. In this way, we get true braking pressure. So I have to learn in any heel hook cycle to cycle outside leg dominance with inside leg dominance. So, coming through from a basic Ashigarami, look how now I'm outside leg dominant. How do I know that? Because my knees are showing which direction we're pushing in. My inside leg has come over and is pushing in this direction. Okay? As we go to apply force, everything switches with the outside Ashigarami. Now, my inside leg, you can clearly see my knees went from pointing to my left, they're now pointing to my right. And as a result, pressure down with my left knee creates braking pressure. So my left knee comes towards my right knee, and the brake is on. We've been looking at the straight Ashigarami system. We've seen that essentially it's composed of 4 distinct steps. Within that system, there are 4 distinct Ashigaramis for each one of those steps. The idea is that we strongly distinguish between the mechanism of control, the Ashigarami, and the mechanism of braking, the heel hook, in this case the outside heel hook. We've seen that our first step is always entry and connection. We use a Rimi Ashigarami as our method of entering our training partner's legs and forming a connection that puts my opponent's knee inside my knee line. Okay? We've seen from here my primary interest is in forming that connection and maintaining it against resistance. Once I see I've got an initial control of my opponent, it's time to go to the second phase of the system, and that's to generate exposure of my opponent's heel. We've seen that a Rimi Ashigarami is not very appropriate for this task. It's okay, you can do it against a beginner, but at highest levels it's risky for me to start pitching down to a shoulder and exposing my own heel to my opponent as I'm digging for his. So a better approach is to switch to another form of Ashigarami. We chose inside Ashigarami, where I take my foot across the center line and expose my opponent's heel. From here, we get an initial grip, a false grip, on our training partner, like so. As a result, we now have the heel under our control, and we're ready to go into the third stage of the system, which is to negate my opponent's attempt at escape. I know what his 3 attempts are. They're always the same. He can either break the structure of my Ashigarami, he can rotate faster than I can rotate, or he can extract his knee from my knee line and play essentially a distance game. I can shut down all 3 of those by quickly locking a Senkaku, so that when he tries to peel my legs apart, one leg is reinforced by the other. I've got a closed system of wedges around both of his hips. It's difficult for him to go after my heels because I've already got a grip on him, while he has none on me. Okay? From here, I go to apply pressure on my training partner's heel that forces him into a roll. I know now he's going to go into the second phase of escape, which is to try and use his foot on my buttocks, and from here, push and get his knee free from my knee line. But by pointing my knee down at the floor, even with no hands, when Kalmasaru goes to run away from me, we never pull free. Okay? Once my knee goes down to the floor, this last thing is to try and backstep over the top. But that leads right into the final phase, the outside Ashigarami. We've seen from here a theory of braking, which involves legs, inside leg, dominating my opponent's knee. Variations in hand grip, each one getting progressively tighter than the next. The idea of opposing forces, my Ashigarami pointing in one direction and my heel hook going in the other. the idea of opposing forces on the foot itself. Every heel hook is composed of a push on the toes and a pull on the heel. We've seen that we put our opponent's toe line into the bicep. We put our wrist below the ankle, and everything begins with a push on the toes and a pull on the heel. This leads to the concept of follow-through, where even with no hands, I can generate tremendous pressure on my training partner by following through the breaking point. Okay? Once we work in this way, you see it's a fairly simple system, and it can be done under stress against a wide variety of opponents in a very short period of time. So, for example, if I have someone in my butterfly guard, it's not a difficult thing for me in these circumstances to start lifting, elevating, popping over into an initial entry. Then from here, it's not a difficult thing to roll through my training partner and come up. And in a matter of seconds, we've got a very strong breaking position down the mat with an outside ashigarami. It seems like a lot, 4 steps, 4 different ashigaramis, but really, it all happens in a matter of seconds. A very useful way to teach, for me to teach you and for you to teach yourself the art of heel hooking in straight ashigarami scenarios is to look at the primary problem that you're trying to overcome. A big part of the way I teach you is to identify what's the main problem in any given scenario that you're trying to overcome in order to get to your goal. The great problem associated with straight ashigarami attacks is always the problem of the shared spiral. An obvious question, what the hell is the problem of the shared spiral? Let's have a look at that right now. A heel hook, of course, is a twisting or spiraling form of lock. Okay, there are some locks that are linear. So for example, an armbar, judogatami, is a linear lock. Everything goes in a straight line. A heel hook, like a kimura or a figure 4 toe hold, is a twisting lock. There's a spiral of forces. Okay? Whenever I go into a heel hook position, the force of my heel hook is followed by my opponent's escape route. They're exactly the same. So the problem is, for most people, there's a danger that as I go to spiral into the lock, he will spiral in the same direction to escape. So we share the same spiral. And so you often get situations, you'll see this in competition all the time, where people just roll and roll and roll, and they're both sharing the same spiral, and nothing gets done. There's no result. They just go out of bounds and get reset. I can never tolerate this. The problem of the shared spiral is, how am I going to stop or curtail that spiraling process? Yes, if my heel hook goes from right to left and my opponent's escape also goes from my right to my left, that's a potential problem. How do I overcome it? A large part of it has to do with the idea of cycling inside and outside leg dominance. We want to finish in an outside ashigarami to stop the cycle of the shared spiral. If I retain the same ashigarami on my opponent as we go into work, my knees are pointing in the same direction as his knees. And as a result, we just keep on rolling together without result. Okay? But if I take my legs to an outside ashigarami position so that my knees are pointing across my training partner's knees, or in extreme examples, even down towards the floor, as my opponent goes to continue the cycle of rolling, he'll break his own leg on my ashigarami. I don't have to do a damn thing. Okay? So if my body is locked in this direction to my right hand side and Kawamoto goes to turn to my left, he'll break his own knee. Okay? There are some common errors made by many beginning students which will exasperate and make worse the problem of the shared spiral. Let's look at the number one, which I always see when I go to teach heel hooking, which I want you to make sure you don't make this mistake. Probably the single most common mistake I see is people rolling over an elbow. When I go into a heel hook situation, I know I want to roll in this direction to ultimately end up in my outside heel hook, okay? My outside ashigarami. a very common mistake which you will see is people prop on an elbow. When they come up, they go to turn, they prop up on an elbow. This is a disaster because my own elbow will slow my rate of rotation, so that when I go to follow Kamasaro's rotation, I end up slower than him and he's gone. Okay? Never, when we go to roll, do I prop myself on an elbow. I always lock my hands to my ribs and I roll smoothly over a shoulder. When I try to roll over an elbow, my elbow stops me and you feel very awkward. You slow down, he keeps the same speed. If he's rotating faster than me, he will escape. I need to be able to rotate at the same speed he's rotating, which means rolling easily over my shoulders. Okay? So let's look at an incorrect roll and a correct roll together. Here, I've successfully employed the lock, but unfortunately I've made a terrible mistake. I've unlocked my hands, and as Kawasawa goes to roll, I've tried to prop myself on my elbow. He rotated faster than me and easily escaped. Avoid this mistake. When we go to roll, always, once we lock up in this position, I roll over my shoulders. Carl, roll as fast as you can. So we're always in the right place. Now, we've created a situation where he goes to roll a second time, he'll break his own leg. Okay, because my Ashigurami is pointing against his roll, as opposed to here, pointing the same direction. Okay? Now, at the start of this DVD, we talked about the idea of reinforcing wedges. We saw that in the case of Ashigurami, I have to reinforce my wedges by locking my legs, either crossing my feet or locking triangles or sankakus around my opponent's legs, because body weight isn't a big part of the Ashigurami game. That was an oversimplification that I had to give to you to first get you around the idea of reinforcing wedges. But there is a way to bring in weight as a means of reinforcing wedges in Ashigurami, and it pays big dividends when it's time to break someone's leg. This is the idea of utilizing the weight of my hips to reinforce the breaking power of my locks. From an outside Ashigurami situation, if my hips stay on the floor when I go to break my training partner's legs, it will put a cap or a ceiling on how far or how much pressure I can apply to my opponent's legs. When I go to break my opponent, I bring my knees down, and the last component is for me to take my hips off the floor so I can get tremendous weight onto the top of my opponent's leg. If my hips are on the mat and I just pull up, it puts a limit on how much torque and how much follow through I can get on my training partner's legs. When it's time to break, I lift my hips on top of my training partner's knees so that the bony, hard fulcrum of my hips goes directly into the inside of his knee. Now I look down at the floor and I lift up in a straight line. So as my head rises, the Ashigurami pushes down. In this way, I've got weight down on the leg. The only part of my body on the floor when I finish is my feet and my elbow. Everything else is off the mat. If my hips are on the floor, my weight gets transmitted to the floor. When my hips come off the floor, my weight gets transmitted to my opponent's knee, so that when I lift up on the heel, we get genuine breaking pressure. The same is true as my back is flat on the mat. As Kawasawa goes to escape from the log, from here, I push down with my feet. Because my hips are on the floor, it's putting a cap on how much power I can generate. But the moment my hips come off the mat, we get genuine breaking power. Okay? I cannot emphasize this enough. When it's time to break, get your hips off the mat. Whether we're down on an elbow, like so, hips off the mat, breaking. Or whether we're flat on our back, hips off the mat, and breaking. Okay? This will greatly amplify your breaking potential in any straight or outside Ashigurami situation.